from the US to Israel, I needed to go 14 days into a quarantine. So I'm living in an 8-square-meter room now for 14 days and cannot go out. So that's my current Corona state, although I don't have any symptoms, but everybody needs to do it. That comes back. So saying that, yes, for me, there is a definition of collective trauma that is very distinct, but it's a very complex kind of systemic process or state. So let's say there is in our work, we differentiate between like what's my personal trauma, like my attachment trauma. Something happened in my life that was painful. There was some abuse, there was some violence, there was like a car accident. Like there's something that happened to me and that I can connect somehow to my biography, well, to my experience, if it wasn't that severe that that's not possible anymore. But there's something about my life and my life experience where the trauma kind of has its place. And then there's transgenerational trauma. This means that what the trauma that my ancestors went through, and it has been passed on in a way as tendencies to me that are kind of more or less alive in me and recreate patterns in my life that are actually going back to that traumatization and might even have follow-up traumatizations in my life, personal traumatizations that are correlating. And then, but then there is a wider frame, and that's very interesting because when I worked, I need to say a little bit how I came to working with collective trauma, because that was actually not what I was looking for. I mean, I didn't research collective trauma when I started my work. And so in the first few years of my work, especially because a lot of it happened also at the beginning in Germany, there were these massive collective eruptions in our workshops. So let's say there are 100 people, and on the day 3 or 4, there was kind of a massive eruption of emotions. Like 50 people started to cry at the same time, and they had strong emotional releases and saw strong images from the Second World War, the Holocaust. And so because that happened in the same way again and again and again, that's what brought me to look at, okay, what's actually speaking through the groups here, and how can we work on it and create processes for that. And so what I found out in the second part is when I worked with individual clients and we went into the deeper trauma, then often the process came to a halt, to a stop. And then it was needed, and that happened for many people with that were born, like for example, at the end of the Second World War in Germany, and they grew up in the last years and in the years after the war. And so the collective dimension of destabilization, so when a whole state, a whole city, like a bigger community gets traumatized, it's very different in my understanding than if one person gets traumatized and the rest is very stable. Because the instability of the social framework, in my understanding, gets entangled or wired into the internal trauma structure of that person. So there is kind of a collective, like trauma, a tribal trauma response as well. So there is an individual and then a collective situation that is very destabilized or fragile at the same time. And I think this really matters. So in the work with individual clients that were part of such a bigger trauma field, the bigger trauma field is very important to be included, first of all, in the personal work. But then it means also that, for example, with all the concentration camps, all the war aftermath, or the war itself and everything that follows, like the next generations that are being born into that field not only carry, I believe, what their ancestors went through, but also carry part of that collective trauma field. And I believe that all of us know the world only in a partly traumatized way. And I think that's a big issue, because it means that I don't have much calibration of anything else. And I think that's very important, because it's like me sitting in a room of a house from day one of my life. And I grow up in this room. I live all my life in this room. And then somebody comes to visit me and asks me, hey, Thomas, tell me something about the house. How does the house look like? But if I've never seen the house, what can I say about the house? Because I just lived in a room. I can say a few things maybe, but I don't know how the house looks like. And so I take this as a kind of a metaphor. And you need to tell me if I'm talking too fast for the translation. I know the translating is often needs a little bit of space. So when I'm too fast, let me know that it's okay. Okay, good. So when I say, wow, there are individual psychological patterns. There are parts of our language. There is a trauma always comes with a fragmentation of the physical, emotional, mental, and relational experience, which means where I'm traumatized, I cannot transmit coherence. I cannot transmit a relational coherence. My nervous system can't do it. My body can't do it. So when I get triggered in a traumatized place, my physical, emotional, and mental self are not one message. So it's not one. It's kind of broken into kind of pieces. And that's why we often hear mental interpretations and not understanding. Understanding is that the mind, the emotions, and the body say the same thing. Interpretations are that I'm trying to figure out what's my experience from a mental level, looking down onto the rest of my experience. And so I believe, since we all have been born into a more or less traumatized field, because my parents might have carried that fragmentation, my teachers, my social environment, the state, like the whole culture. So I'm so used to fragmentation that I don't know a state without it, most probably. And so that means that and I think that's the important thing about trauma, is that as long as I know I'm traumatized, and let's say I can tell you, Julia, I'm hurt here, I know that I'm hurt here, and I will go and take care of it. It's like I have a big wound on my arm, and I know that I have a big wound on my arm, and I go to the doctor or to the hospital, and I ask for a medical treatment. So then I'm doing the right thing, because if I don't do it, then I come to you, Julia, often and say, why do I all the time have life-threatening inflammations? And then I'm coming with the symptom and not the real thing. Because if I know I'm hurt, I know I'm hurt. If I don't know that I'm hurt, I will deal all the time with the side effects. And so when we look at our cultural process, our language often is the agreement, that we fixed a traumatized reality often as normal. And that's very important, because, 30 years ago, when I went to medical school, if I had said, let's Google this, everybody would have looked at me and said, Thomas, what are you talking about? What do you mean Google? Google didn't mean anything. Today, if you say, oh, I'm going to Google this, it means a lot. because everybody carries an agreement that that encodes a reality. So language is the encoding pattern of our reality. But if a certain way of speaking is informed by my trauma and my dissociation, and it's the same for you, then we fixate, like we fix a reality that is actually heard as normal. So on a deeper level, when the next generation gets born through the collective trauma field, we internalize that, we grow up in it, and we speak the language of the trauma field, and we create social structures that are based on pain and trauma and ice more than on bricks, which means the house, the walls of the house of humanity are built partly out of stones and bricks, and are built partly out of bricks that are ice. And there, that's a very big difference. Because, for example, now with the Corona crisis, we see that there's an actual health issue that really needs to be taken care of, but there's a lot of collective panic that comes up, like the ghosts of the past come up with it. And then we have lots of reactions and reactivities and decisions that might actually hurt the systems, sometimes even more, than if we were able to respond to the situation appropriately. And so, in my understanding, trauma always creates a ghost, like a disembodied energy that needs to be integrated. If it's not integrated, it's past. So that's why I say often, integrated history is presence, unintegrated history is the past. The past is not what happened yesterday. The past is what's left over. It's kind of the residue of yesterday. That's the past. Because the rest of history sits in my body, sits in my emotions, sits in my mind. What Plato thought, I can also think today maybe. And what my ancestors learned 100,000 years ago still sits in my body as DNA and nervous system, organs, cells. So the past is not what the whole history. The whole history is included in me. The past is only the not included part that makes me walk around on the street being scared without danger. That's the past. So when I'm scared, or when my past starts to overshadow my experience. And that's why when we, just to finish the introduction maybe, so when the more I understood, wow, there is actually, like, there are tremendous amounts of energy in heavily collectively traumatized societies. There's a huge lake of past that through our dissociation and denial functions, we are able to keep away. Otherwise, they would flood us every day when we sit in the office. So it's good that we have a way to suppress that. But we need to be aware that that's just lingering around. So that's energy that hasn't been processed. And I think when we move into situations that are more scary, more threatening, or maybe collectively more threatening, those ghosts gonna be reawakened again. And they will heavily have an effect on the human intelligence, because that limits our ability to respond. And in English, there's a very lovely word, like responsibility means the ability to respond. It's a lovely word. Like when I'm responsible, I'm able to respond. When I'm triggered in my past, I'm reacting from the past. Like I'm reacting from a smaller version of myself. And that's a huge difference. So if I react to the Corona situation, or if I respond to it, makes a huge difference for the healthcare system, for politicians, for every citizen. And so that's a little bit the framework of collective trauma. So collective trauma literally includes the individual trauma and the ancestral trauma, but there's another dimension to it, I think, that is very important, that happens when large parts of the society experience a trauma approximately in the similar time frame, and the traumatization is very kind of in a destabilized field. And I think that has a huge effect on us. And then that the next generation has been born through that and knows reality through that lens. And so that it's upon us to find out how the house looks like, because no one ever saw it. No one was ever outside of it. We only know it from inside, from the room. We don't know it from outside. And so that's why everyone's perception is a little bit distorted. And that's why I think that's why when we come together in communities, when we heal it ourselves, when we help heal each other, all of this increases the probability that we will at least dismantle the structures that are frozen. Because I think that the main obstacle to evolution is that or to change, when things need to change on the planet, in life, in societies, in a person's life, change is our natural, like movement is our natural state. And the reduction of movement is causing all kinds of side effects. So when we have to change, for example, with climate change, we have to change some ways, the way we are living together on this planet. But trauma doesn't want to change. Trauma wants to stay frozen. And maybe the last thing, I love the metaphor of, you know, when snowflakes fall into the river, they become water. When snowflakes fall on iced over rivers, the snow piles up. So when experience falls into openness in us, it becomes flow, it becomes water. But when a follow-up experience hits the ice in us, we call it problem, difficulty, or hard, painful. It's a painful experience. It's a difficulty. So more snow on the ice, more snow on the ice, more snow on the ice, until we learn how to melt it and make it water. And water, like the flow, is kind of our natural state. And so, like a lot of the healing work, I believe that collective trauma healing needs actually collectives. It needs big we spaces that can learn how to presence them, create appropriate relations, safety, and the appropriate presence in order to include, like integrate the ghosts of the past. So maybe that's just a short summary. I mean, I could go on for a long time, but I don't want to stretch this too much with the theory. So maybe we can take this as a frame for maybe more questions, and then maybe live questions, so that we have a more live conversation.
Yeah, it was beautiful. I like the way how you, by answering one question, you answer kind of 10 questions that have been sent to us. And I guess I'm very curious, because there was some specific questions concerned to what do you feel when you attune to Russia or to the Russian society? If you have some feelings, or how to kind of support the evolution of Russia, or the growing up of Russia, or Yes, and do you, yeah, if you have a vision of reconciliation.
Right.
And maybe what do you see how how does Russia collective trauma influence the rest of the world, the global space?
I think our all collective trauma influences each other. So I don't think like every nations or every collective trauma creates issues in the global collaboration. And I think what we need at the moment, one of the things that we need the most is to find ways how to increase the global collaboration. I think that's an evolutionary pattern that, given the density of our population on the planet, is super important. And trauma increases fragmentation. And I think what we need at the moment is an opening into kind of a higher coherence. And so when we say yes, of course, every nation's traumatization affects the rest of the world, and is also a chance, because in the trauma reconciliation, like when enough people start to pay attention to it, bring their awareness to it, and start to create healing fields, then we actually de-ice a lot of human capacity. So what's frozen in the trauma is not only pain, but development. Human development that has been frozen in parts of our being. And so my experience, every time when I work with a client or also in front of the group, so we see in the moment something melts, there are actually two movements that happen in a person. One is a deeper relaxation into embodiment, and an impulse that ripples up the spine, energizes the whole cortex and neocortex, and is actually a movement into the future. So the person can literally expand the radius of his or her life. So there are two movements, one that ripples back into the past, into like our grounding first, into our deeper embodiment, and then upwards into more creativity and innovation. So I think when we de-ice collective trauma layers skillfully, we actually liberate a lot of energy for development. And we see this also when, for example, on a 5-year-old level, a child gets traumatized, then not only does the child freeze the pain or the overwhelm, but the child also freezes part of that level's development. That's why in grown-up relation, sometimes we answer to our wife or our husband like a 5-year-old, like a regressive child, like a child. We are regressive. So I'm actually being called back exactly to the level of my development that couldn't fully integrate itself into the whole. And so that's why whenever we tune in with individuals, and the same is also true for cultures, the pain of the Second World War lives, let's say 1944 in Europe. So in the collective nervous system, 1944 is a huge storage of information and a huge storage of unintegrated energy that maybe has been digested somehow through the next generations, but is still pretty charged. And if we de-ice those layers, like if we learn how to integrate them through individual psychotherapy, for example, through individual trauma work, and through collective trauma work, then we liberate a lot of energy to become creative and to increase the possibilities of humanity. And so, yes, I think there are lots of things that we can do, and I think that we need to do all over the world, because those scars are specific to areas, but they are kind of very present. There are many scars that the planet has, so to speak, that we carry and that we inflicted upon each other. And so I believe that, yeah, we influence each other, and not only influence each other, we actually are locked. because I believe every trauma creates a trauma lock. And that's very powerful too. Like when the trauma happens between different countries, they also are locked with each other. There's something that is kind of stays connected and has to be connected. They have a mutual destiny with each other. And it's just a matter of time in history until that mutual destiny will show itself. And because I often say that when conscious energy or experience is possibility, but unconscious energy is a destiny. Unconscious energy runs me, whereas when it's aware, there's a possibility to change. And so that's, I believe, true for cultures too. Cultures, when the trauma, the unconscious trauma between nations becomes their mutual destiny until it's being resolved. And so that's why I think, yes, we affect each other kind of all the time, and more so, we actually linked to each other in a very strong way too. And that's, I think, a powerful aspect of it too.
That's beautiful. And I guess there are many how-to questions to this, you know, how to do this kind of collective trauma individual work, how to do it in say, kind of safe fields, and how to create coherence in a field at all. You know, maybe you can say something to this.
Yeah, I think like every skilled like therapist or psychotherapist or trauma therapist knows that the fragmentation is always spreading around the trauma. So fragmentation creates kind of more fragmentation in the social system. When a CEO of a company is traumatized, so you will see the effects of the trauma most probably in the whole organization somehow. And if we are aware, because it spreads like the particles organize themselves like that. And so we can, when we notice symptoms of that fragmentation, and we learn to host those symptoms in us because we are free enough to do that, then I can be with an individual client, but I can also, as a group, let's say we brought 1,000 people together in a university in Berlin some years ago, and we worked on this Second World War Holocaust trauma in Germany. And we had a video conference with a group in Israel. And so we looked at how a group and a group coherence, which we built through safety. So we had 40 psychotherapists or therapists there. We had, we created relational exercises. And through attunement, we created a stronger kind of we space. And then we always need to see, I think what's very important is that there's a big mix. If people don't do their personal work, it's very hard to go to the collective work. So we need more and more people that did enough individual work to heal like their individual traumatization, at least to some extent, because otherwise the discernment of individual and collective is not possible. So everything's being put into one pot, and then I speak a lot about collective in order to avoid my own inner process. So then it becomes like a mess. But if we have a clear discernment, so then it's beautiful, because then I can say, okay, this is your biographical individual traumatization. These are influences that come up through your ancestors, and that's the collective field. And then we find ways to navigate between, or even, you know, move between the three and work skillfully. And I think that's the best to do. But what we need to do for it, I believe, is so what we do what we train with in our courses a lot is to have a high level of internal resonance capacity, which means that I train a lot embodiment, emotional emotional fluidity, like that I can learn to discern and hear in my clients more and more the kind of where mental structures become the avoidance patterns of the experience, and so that I can in myself and in others create a stronger field of coherence in my nervous system. So that's one thing we practice, so the integration work. And then we practice a lot the relational work. So I feel you and I feel how you feel me. I feel you feeling me. I feel you feeling me. And to extend that capacity when I talk to somebody, that communication is actually not just self-expression, but communication is the awareness process of me talking and feeling what actually you hear. So when I speak, that I have a continuous awareness of what the person receives and how the person feels me. And when we create this kind of resonance field, I feel you feeling me, I feel you feeling me, then my whole body is looking, and my physical body can know a lot about your physical body because they talk to each other. They don't need my mind as a translator. My body feels your body directly. My emotions feel your emotions directly. They don't need a translator. I don't need to translate Italian into Chinese. That's not needed. But my mind, with my mind, I can talk with you about science, I can talk about Plato, philosophy, art, like many things. We can enjoy the intelligence, but not as a translation device. My body is direct, not indirect. When it's indirect, it's already a symptom. So when coherence creates I feel you feeling me on a more and more continuous basis, and people who are practicing this more and more often, around them, there's a kind of a field of coherence expanding into the collective. And so that will ripple out. And then through the relational attunement that we can track trauma in other people's nervous systems exactly on the level of age that it happened. So when somebody has been traumatized at age 3, the trauma is encoded at age 3 in the nervous system of the person. So I need to be able to modulate, to follow the symptoms at age 3 and create a specific relation on that level of our meeting. And so that's what so then we meet like a laser the trauma on the level where it happens, not on the level where it's interpreted, but where it's really happening in the nervous system. And so when we do that skillfully, and then we create spaces where at least we take some of these capacities and we create bigger fields where through the group complexity, the fragmentation of the culture starts to appear. It's a little bit like a process, you know, in some of the films, in the fantasy films, you see people looking at the surface of water, and on the surface of water, information appears. And collective trauma work is a little bit like that the group starts to speak the information of the system. And when I learn to listen to what the group speaks and which voices are more personal, which voices are more collective, and I pay attention, I highlight the collective voices, then it's like a book. You highlight certain sentences, and those sentences carry the information of the collective trauma the most. And so in what we call the CTIP, the collective trauma integration processes, so we have like a process description of how we run those and how I experience them. It's kind of a description of how it showed up in my process work, and which phase comes after which phase. And so what a whole group goes through until we come to a level of kind of new integration. So that of course we cannot process the whole collective trauma, but we process a chunk of it, and then the whole group comes to kind of a resting point at the end, where that's what this group can do for now, so that it's the right portion that the group can do without getting overwhelmed or like re-traumatized. So that's a little bit, so we need this kind of skill set on the individual level, the same skill set I can use to work with transgenerational trauma. So the grandparents of my clients, how I work with the grandparents of my client in the room, and then how I include the collective when I work with one person, or how we include the collective as a group. So this is a little bit, I know it's a lot of information for one call. That's why I don't want to make it too theoretical, the whole call, because I know it's might be a bit overwhelming. If it's too much, let me know. We are trying to put a lot of information into 90 minutes. So yeah. I'm also happy for some dialogue. If you have some more questions that came in before, let me know.
Maybe just before I will give the mic to Katja, just one last practical question. There were some questions about collaboration, how we can learn from you, how we can, or people in Russia can create a pocket, for example.
That would be lovely. I would love that. And maybe we can have from time to time calls like this where we can reflect questions that come up in the work. Maybe we can, from other pocket groups, like give you the information, or you know some of it, Julia, and from the trainings that we did. Maybe we can just, you know, provide some information, at least how we look at it, and then you can see how you metabolize this in your own, into your own way. And then we can do sometimes calls like here and reflect on the processes and maybe see what's the work that we can do online. I think there are many ways how we could collaborate. And also my book will come out in November. And that's pretty much a good description of the whole last 15 years of this work. And we have other pocket groups that maybe can provide some of the practices that we do in the pocket groups. And then zoom into the specificity of the kind of Russian architecture, I would say. Yeah. Yeah, I would love that. I'm very interested in this myself. Because as you know, at the last Celebrate Life Festival, we did a large-scale group process on the East-West separation of Europe, like in Germany and also in Europe, and that was a very powerful process. And I think there's a deep healing potential if we do this all over Europe. And I would be also very interested in learning more about Russia through this work.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful, very excited. I suggest one kind of impulse from someone here. Maybe it's a good idea just to kind of integrate this and maybe to have a couple of minutes. Yes. If you would like to guide us somehow, like to give a bit time to land before we move a couple of minutes to the Q&A portion.
Right. Right. I think it's anyway good to see when, because I said now many things within a short time, and all of these things can be unpacked much more, of course. And so to see what, when you take a moment to look into yourself, into your own body, and into your own physical, emotional, mental experience, what are the things that resonate with you What are the things that resonate less with you? What are the things maybe that are abstract, things that are very clear? And to adjust this in your own, like in relation to your own work, since there are many also psychotherapists here. And maybe also when you reflect, I mean, since all of you are experts in some way, when you reflect on the kind of collective architecture of Russia, your country, like different layers, it's like collective trauma, like it's like an architecture. Some of it is already more digested, maybe some of it is less digested. What's the collective architecture or collective fragmentation? And how does it express itself in the society? Where do you see in your society the after effects of this kind of fragmentation, separation, splitting? And then maybe also to see what are like individual or professional and or questions that come up, like how you individually affected maybe, and professionally with your clients in your own process work with groups. Well, maybe since we just have a limited time, maybe we can also like have a bit of a dialogue if anybody wants. I don't know if that's possible with the translation.
Yes, and we decided to invite people who want to ask a question in Russian to this room, and we will translate the question consecutively. Or people who can ask a question in English, they can feel free and raise their hands and come on live. So we have 2 raised hands. And the first one was Tanya, but Tanya, I don't know if you just tested your raise hand button. Maybe you can say something, Tanya.
Yes. Yes. One of my questions was quite concrete because I was fortunate enough to experience Thomas's work personally in the context of the meeting in Nevelan. What I remember, and I was absolutely stunned by Thomas's ability to react so directly, somatically, and perceive so accurately. It was uncanny that he could immediately understand what was going on within my body and how my history, my trauma expressed itself in the current moment. And so this is an unbelievable level of skill, and I was wondering if it can be taught or it can be shown how to achieve that.
Yeah, of course it can be taught. I mean, of course, like in every art, it depends. I mean, there are like some people simply feel closer to some skill and some less. Like maybe I'm not so close to playing the piano well, and even if I learned it, I wouldn't be like a world-class piano player. But yes, we as you said, like we learn how to, through kind of an inner clarification process and through a relational clarification process, because they need to be practiced together, so that I learn to know my own body really well, because that's the instrument. Like I need to tune my instrument. I need to know what are my own trauma layers and work on them, like to more and more integrate them. Of course, my emotional and mental kind of unity, that this becomes a flow. But then it's also with the relational piece, because some things show up only in the relation, and some things show up when I'm relating to myself. So I need to work on both me and the relation. And then yes, because as I said before, my body knows your body. My nervous system knows your nervous system, just by being in the same room, just by tuning, setting the attention of attunement, like lets a mutual information field kind of arise. And that's something we can train. So for example, in our training programs, that's something we do exercises for, we reflect on. I do many processes with people in front of, like what you also saw in Nevelan. People spoke up in the group, and then we did a process, and then in the trainings we reflect on the process afterwards. So we say, okay, that's what's happening in the person's body, that's what's happening in the emotions, in the mind, and in the energy field. And yeah, so I think of course it's possible to teach it. I also see it in some of my, like we have a whole group of therapists that we trained already. And I see that, of course, and you know, there are people that are then more skilled or more talented, and other people maybe a bit less. But it's with the right ingredients and the long breath, so that it's something we really need to, you know, invest time and energy and practice. Yeah, it's teachable, and it's also learnable. And I think also if I apply it often and I practice it often in my daily life, that's an amazing platform, because some of these things I can practice all the time. And if I do it in my daily life all the time, is, you know, you see it also with kids and teenagers. There are some teenagers that simply don't have that drive, and then there are some they practice and nobody really told them to do that, and they still like doing it all the time. Yeah, and they are driven. They really want that. And I think if we, like in every sport discipline or any kind of art discipline, or even scientists, you know, some scientists, they zoom into one aspect of life in such a deep way, and that creates excellence. Excellence is this deep presence and a deep commitment to that kind of inner drive and the practice that it comes with. And it also means maybe that if I practice so much, maybe these kids, you don't see them on every party. So it also comes with a certain amount of kind of the healthy aspect of the sacrifice, that I need to let go of some things in order to invest them in what I want to study. So to really invest enough energy. But if I do that, then my capacity grows, because I believe that I often say, you know, like if you hold kind of a 3-week-old baby, even now, like when I say it, you even have a smile on your face. Like if you hold a young baby, immediately your nervous system knows how to talk to that baby. You know, you wouldn't talk to a baby like to your business partner. And why not? Because your nervous system modulates itself to the level of age, to the level of development, to the pace, the rhythm, the spaciousness of a baby, like the emotional closeness it needs. So there are many aspects that parenting, healthy parenting, already, like we come evolutionary wise. It's like when you buy a car and the car has a GPS and has this and an assistant for driving and whatever. So that's the basic model. And the basic model of a human being comes with an evolutionary function of attunement. And then when the child is 5 years old, you talk to the child already differently. And when the child is 12 years old, differently. And the same function we professionalize. Mm-hmm. And then when we professionalize that function, plus maybe some of the spiritual practice or the transpersonal practice to strengthen this, all together is gets there. Yeah. Does this answer your question, or is there something more specific?
Generally, yes. I just wanted to tell you that I've been trained in a traditional psychodynamic therapy, but throughout my long professional practice, I noticed that there is this automatically arising a process of attunement that happens with the clients. And sometimes they convey you a certain information non-verbally, and you just know what's going to happen, what they're thinking and what they are about to say. It just arises in you. So it's pretty much like what you experience.
Right. Okay. Right. And to make this process into a higher and higher and higher resolution. And then we expand the map. So first we do it with the client in the room. Then maybe I can do it with the parents of the client in the room. Then I can do it with the grandparents of, I can increase the ancestral stream.
Yes.
And then maybe we do it together with the collective fields that we have. Yeah. And that's beautiful. Yeah, that's exactly it.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. And before next live was Katya, who was reading in chat. Maybe there are some questions from the chat that came. Katya?
Hello, I'm here. I can't unmute myself. There were a couple of questions from Russian chat, one from Chris, no, from Sergey. Looks like we need to be proud of our country's trauma. There was the comment on one of your talk. And then I will add up my question to that comment, whether that unjustified proud can be a sign of trauma and maybe a typical Russian collective trauma, and how we can address that, feeling of proud of being traumatized, proud to be victim. There is one question, and there is another question from Alena. For people who have immigrated from post-Soviet geography to other countries, are any suggestions what we should be aware of, especially if we're born in post-Soviet times, in attempting to work with Russian-speaking trauma? And the third question, just look how you can address it. How we define that going to the collective level is not just an avoiding your painful personal experience.
Yeah, that's very important. Let's start with that, because that's what I meant before. Like, we need to have a certain level of individual trauma work in place. Otherwise, the collective just becomes a kind of a bypass function. And then I don't need to deal with my own pain or my own traumatization. I think that's a very important comment. And I think that's what we also see often, that when we open up the dimension of the collective, that it's an easy target for my defense pattern. And I need to see that that's happening and not allow this as a facilitator to happen, so that I bring the attention back to the first individual work, and then naturally from there we can expand. So that's why in our work we work a lot with circles of intimacy. Like, the innermost circle of intimacy is my self-contact, then my core family, and then from there outwards till the community, the society, the state, the world, and so on. And that in doubt, when things are not clear, to always come back to the innermost circle of intimacy. So when it's not clear if it's a personal or collective, let's come back to the personal first. And so if I follow this, I think then I prevent of getting confused. And from there, I can kind of expand outwards. I think that's very important. And yes, I agree with the pride. I think sometimes pride is a way, like, I can see it on my degree of vulnerability. Like, if I feel that I'm resting in a state of vulnerability, I know my heart's open. I'm in a level of coherence or synchronization of my heart. I can emotionally resonate. I'm not defended. So when these things are in place, there's a healthy kind of level of self-confidence. But in the moment, like often when we go into pride, it's actually an elevation that I'm not able to fully rest in myself. On the other hand, I think it's very important to see, like, all the trauma functions and responses in ourselves and also systemically in the culture are intelligent functions. So when we get overwhelmed, how we deal with that overwhelm is an intelligent function. The denial of a lot of pain in a concentration camp, to survive a concentration camp with a lot of dissociation, because maybe that's the only way to do it for most of the people, maybe, is an intelligent function. That also means that a lot of energy is being suppressed into the collective subconscious. That's different. That's also true. But the function that did it was the best an individual or collective could do in the given situation. And so if I find always a relation to the intelligence of the process, then it's not pride as a defense pattern, it's honoring the process. And honoring the process is the only way to re-own it. Because if I don't want that collective trauma, I have no access to it, because I don't want it. Actually, I want to get rid of it. But if I relate and find a relation, then I get access to the function that's split off in my own nervous system, and we together to surface the collective pain that we denied. And in a way, it's kind of cleaning up our collective living room. Like, collective trauma work is cleaning up the living room together. And if that happens in many places in the world, I think we find a more sustainable humanity, since kind of the overspeed, the too fastness of our current systems is often based on fear. So when we try to be faster than life is, usually we are walking on ice. And I think that's why also the coronavirus shows us kind of not that the health implications are serious, but the collective slowdown is also in a way function of too much energy, for the cup is too small. So the embodiment cannot ground the experience. Yeah, so that was the pride. And if we live like immigration, I think immigration is a much bigger topic than it's usually being handled. We looked at in different places at where immigration it was and is maybe a big topic, that really moving from one cultural aspect to another and finding maybe often a whole new life or existence in a different culture needs a lot of awareness. Otherwise, I can do it, but I actually need to power through the unintegrated part of the immigration, because immigrating is scary. There are many social issues that I'm not part of, that I need to learn. Maybe my children grow up and they're kind of partly foreigners, and there's a shame that comes with this and many other things. It's a very sensitive process. And I think if parents, especially when we move as families, when parents have enough resources to, inner and outer resources to be parents, that's great. But often in immigration families, the parents are very busy with themselves. We're trying to make a living. We're trying to make it existentially, dealing with their own difficulties. So often the kids are more left alone. And so it's not only the immigration issue that I have with myself as a grown-up, it's also the ones that I pass on through my kids to the next generation. And I think to be mindful as immigrants and to create maybe community, not as an isolation, like we and them, but as a support system, might be a very good thing. Because often, like we are not trained in really integrating the difficulties and going through that process sustainably. So it's often based on a lot of stress, and that stress is kind of stored in the system, in the body, in the nervous system, in the emotional system, and later on it has kind of consequences often. So that's what, like, that's just short, because immigration is a whole like other topic that we could have a whole call on. What are the side effects of immigration? But I think if you do it sustainably, then it's beautiful.
Thank you. Just show me the author of this question, whether it is, addressed and replied. There more clarity on that. And we also have a question from Kira. She's raising a hand. Probably I can invite her to voice out her question. It's quite long.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure what my level of English is enough. Nice to see you. Yeah, I'm Kira Bogoslovskaya, sociologist, psychologist, and so on. Can I speak Russian? Because my question is complicated, but I need help to translate it accurately. Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Как-то удобнее будет, давай.
Да, у вас получше английский. Значит, пару дней назад обнаружилось, что лидер России собирается остаться лидером всю жизнь. И у меня вопрос к... Сейчас. Можно ли считать коллективной травмой толерантность к жизни при тоталитарном режиме? Или наоборот, нетолерантность к этому, это самое, больший признак этой травмы? Потому что первое, как бы, вроде бы сохраняет стабильность, которую у нас в стране принято ставить в кавычки, да, многими. Определенные культурные группы принято ставить в кавычки. А, собственно, нетолерантность создает развитие, оппозицию и так далее. В чем разница между стабильностью и развитием, между стагнацией, стабильностью и развитием? Вот так бы я спросила. Спасибо.
Влад, ты включишься помочь с переводом или как кто? Ты попробуешь, я что комментирую? Илья? У тебя есть тот звук?
Так, окей, давай я в одном месте микрофон включу, в другом выключу. Well, I'll try to translate that.
First of all, thank you for translating. I see you're doing a great job,
Thanks
and
a lot. Yeah.
you're here really like the whole time on. So thank you.
Помогу, если что. Давай.
Okay. So here is a question. A couple of days ago, the Russian president has decided to be the president till the end of his life by putting the changes into Russian constitution. And in Russia, we have like both phenomena. We have sometimes inadequate tolerance towards this kind of totalitarian regime. And on the other hand, we have inadequate intolerance to such behavior and such political things happening in the country. So can it be considered that this tolerance is a sign and symptom of a collective trauma in Russian, or it's vice versa, inadequate intolerance is a sign and symptom of the trauma? Because the first one creates, well, is supposed to create the stability, and the second one destabilizes the culture. So what is this fine line between the destabilization and development from the collective trauma point of view?
Thanks a lot, Vlad. Excellent translation.
She just tested your translation skills because she understood everything. It's lovely. Right. Yeah, that's a complex question. So, like, I'm happy you're raising this question because I think it's for me, like I can only tell you how I look at this. Like for me, both is true in different ways. I think that the collective trauma might create like a frozenness within a cultural framework that limits the ability, or is the reason why also the ability is being limited continuously to actually come to a deeper expansion of the society. And so I think that that's true too. On the other hand, we have seen multiple revolutions in the world that unskillfully, and often it's said that it's gonna change things for the better, but then history often proved, and we see it even right now in the world, that once that unskillful destabilization of a culture happens, sometimes it even leads to a worse situation. So I think that's both very true, and that's why it's a much more complex question. How does kind of an evolutionary expansion happen within a culture, maybe in a new way or a different way, that is not the one and not the other, and it emerges somehow out of a strength within many individuals in a different way. And I think that the question that you are asking is very important for our times, because we see it in multiple places around the world right now, that actually the revolution led to an inherent chaos and to a lot of suffering, and not really to a better situation, but just to a much more fragmented situation. And I think your question is really important. Because that's the polarization, and what's actually in the center. So that's the polarization. You described the poles, and now we need to find out why they are two.
Mm-hmm.
You know, every question that arises always shows a separation from the answer. If there is a question, the question is separate from the answer. And so when we say, wow, so when a question arises, what's the question a symptom of? Why is the question and the answer two and not two? When a question is answered, the question and the answer become not two. So every time a question arises, it's it shows us only that there is an invisible force here that split it. And so our job, I think your job as a psychologist, which you're doing most probably often during the day with your clients and many others here too, is that we are the detectives that are looking at the root of a question. And I think at the root of the question is a lot of collective trauma. That's true. And by de-icing some of the trauma, these poles usually move closer and closer and closer together so that the question can find its answer. And I believe you're right. It's very important also to see that maybe the regular way of revolutions or unskillful destabilization of cultures is maybe often not the thing that we want to do. But the inertia is also not the thing we want to do. So what's actually in the middle? And I think that's a very deep, not only philosophical, it's a philosophical, a spiritual, and a very deep human question. Because in both ways, I need to cut something off. Either I cut part of myself off, or I cut part of the other. There's always a heavy price. Like there's a price. Staying quiet or unskillful destabilization. Or I need to cut off another part of myself. And so what is actually a new way, and I think that's very interesting to explore, what's a new way that there is to free up enough energy so that the kind of healthy evolutionary energy can more and more become the answer of that. And maybe like that we also gonna more and more end the painful history of humanity that has been played out over tens of thousands of years and longer, that we repeat it again and again because of the same polarization. And I think, I don't know if that's, we don't have enough time here today, but I think that question could be taken for a separate call. Like what does that mean? And to go into this is a very lovely exploration, like also with a self, like an own process work. And I think it's a very powerful question for humanity in general.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's what I can say now, given our time, but I'm very grateful for the question.
Thanks a lot, yeah. Sure, I have the next question before it, but I'm afraid that we have no time now for this. Yeah, thank you, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And we will come back together. I enjoyed the conversation, and if you want it, I'm happy to make again some time, and then we can.
Sure, yeah, with big pleasure, yeah. It's a big conversation, I know, yeah. Thanks a lot, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I would recommend everybody to write their question maybe after this meeting, or what questions were not replied, and then we can make a list and send you and think of another topic and another meeting and discussion.
Yes, I would love that.
Let's have it as a follow-on event.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much, Thomas. It was very rich, very powerful, and I feel like a lot of hope and curious go into.
Very much for sharing presence and wisdom and different perspectives.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. I'm sorry that we had to postpone the call, but hopefully everybody else can see the recording, and then maybe we can, if you want to, if there's enough interest, maybe we can do another one and continue this we can zoom to many of the topics, we just open them a bit, but we can unpack a lot of, and we can maybe also choose a specific aspect of collective trauma and then open it together. Yeah, lovely.
So thank you. Thank you, beautiful evening. And thank you,
Yeah,
everyone.
thank
Very
you,
much for
everybody.
having time. Yep.
Yeah, thank you. I will
Mm.
go to the next call now. Thank you.
Yes, enjoy the next call.
Спасибо Владу огромное большое за перевод.
Yeah, from me also, Vlad, I felt you. Thank you so much. Thank
Yeah, and
you.
thank you, Julia, for
Tired from my
initiating
monotonous
this.
voice in
Yeah.
another room.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Great, thank you. So I will
Okay.
jump off the line now. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, yes, you're free. Bye.
Bye. Так, ну и что, организационно тогда, Юль, наверное, скажешь еще про то, что там запись будет выложена, если что-то еще организационно надо сказать.
Yes, the recording is going to be available maybe a couple of hours, or yes, more, yes, a couple of hours, I guess. And we will send you a link via mail and in the Facebook groups on collective trauma. And for those who became a personal invitation, I'm going to send a link to. And yes, thank you for being here. It was a pleasure, and I know we couldn't address all the questions, but maybe you felt that all the questions that you sent to us we sent them to Thomas, and he tried to kind of embrace a lot of them. So okay, so I wish you a beautiful day, evening, night, whatever, and bye. And maybe I can just open all the mics, and you can just say a collective bye or whatever you want.
Спасибо, все немножко так получилось суетно в плане вопросов, техники и всего остального, но вот твоя устойчивость, стабильность и вообще прекрасный настройка и английский. Запись будет, нам всем помогли это сделать. Запись будет, и будет возможность сделать пост, написать эти вопросы, которые важно передать их Томасу, и, может быть, дальше обсудить там в каком-то режиме, который нам будет более комфортно, чтобы не